One interesting thing to get back to college campuses is FIRE keeps the college free speech rankings
Yes.
at rankings.thefire.org.
I'm very proud of them.
I highly recommend, because forget even just the ranking, you get to learn a lot about the universities from this entirely different perspective than people are used to when they go to pick whatever university they want to go to. It just gives another perspective on the whole thing, and it gives quotes from people that are students there and so on, like about their experiences, and it gives different. Maybe you could speak to the various measures here before we talk about who's in the top 5 and who's in the bottom 5. What are the different parameters that contribute to the evaluation?
So people have been asking me since day one to do a ranking of schools according to freedom of speech. And even though we had the best database in existence of campus speech codes, policies that universities have that violate First Amendment or First Amendment norms, we also have the best database of what we call the disinvitation database. But it's actually it's better named the deplatforming database, which is what we're going to call it.
And these are all cases where somebody was invited as a speaker to campus,
Yep.
and then were disinvited.
Disinvited or deplatforming also includes shouting down.
So they showed up
and
they couldn't really speak.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And so having that, what we really needed in order to have some serious social science to really make a serious argument about what the ranking was to be able to, one, get a better sense of how many professors were actually getting punished during this time. And then the biggest missing element was to be able to ask students directly what the environment was like on that campus for freedom of speech. Are you comfortable disagreeing with each other? Are you comfortable disagreeing with your professors? Do you think violence is acceptable in response to a speaker? Do you think shouting down is okay? Do you think blocking people's access to a speaker is okay? And once we were able to get all those elements together, we first did a test run, I think in 2019, of about 50, and we've been doing it for 4 years now, always trying to make the methodology more and more precise to better reflect the actual environment at particular schools. And this year, the number one school was Michigan Technological University, which was a nice surprise. The number 2 school was actually Auburn University, which was nice to see. In the top 10, the most well-known prestigious school is actually UVA, which did really well this year. University of Chicago was not happy that they weren't number 1, but University of Chicago was 13, and they had been number 1 or in the top 3 for years prior to that.
Really? So can you explain? It's almost surprising. Is it because of like the really strong economics departments and things like this, or what? Why?
They had a case involving a student. They wouldn't recognize a chapter of Turning Point USA, and they made a very classic argument and classic in the bad way, that we hear at campuses across the country. Oh, we have a campus Republicans, so we don't need this additional conservative group. And we're like, no, I'm sorry. Like, we've seen dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of attempts to get this one particular conservative student group derecognized or not recognized. And so we told them, like, listen, we told them at FIRE that, we consider this serious, and they wouldn't recognize the group. So that's a point down in our ranking, and it was enough to knock them from, they probably would have been number 2 in the rankings. But now they're 13 out of 248. They're still one of the best schools in the country. I have no problem saying that. The school that did not do so well, at a negative 10.69, negative 10.69, and we rounded up to 0, was Harvard. And Harvard has been not very happy with that result.
The only school to receive the abysmal ranking.
Yeah. And there are a couple people.
Oh, Harvard.
Oh, Harvard. And there are a couple people who have actually been really, I think, making a mistake by getting very Harvard sounding, by being like, I've had statisticians look at this and they think your methodology is a joke, and like pointing out, and this case wasn't that important, and that scholar wasn't, that scholar, like one of the arguments against one of the scholars that we counted against them for punishing was that wasn't a very, famous or influential scholar. And I'm kind of like, so your argument seems to be snobbery, like essentially that, like, you're not understanding our methodology, for one thing, and then you're saying that actually that scholar wasn't important enough to count. And by the way, Harvard, if we
The Harvard campus.
Even if we took all of your arguments as true, even if we decided to get rid of those two professors, you would still be in negative numbers. You would still be dead last. You would still be after Georgetown and Penn, and neither of those schools are good for freedom of
We
speech.
should say the bottom five is the University of Pennsylvania, like you said, Penn, the University of South Carolina, Georgetown University, and Fordham University.
All very well earned. They have so many bad cases at all of those schools.
What's the best way to find yourself in the bottom five if you're a university? What's the fastest way to that negative, to that zero?
A lot of deplatforming. When we looked at the bottom five, 81% of attempts to get speakers deplatformed were successful at the bottom five. There were a couple schools, I think Penn included, where every single attempt, every time a student a student group objected to that speaker coming, they canceled this speech. And I think Georgetown was 100% success rate. I think Penn had 100% success rate. I think Harvard did stand up for a couple, but mostly people got deplatformed there as well.
So how do you push back on deplatforming? Well, who would do it? Is it other students? Is it faculty? Is it the administration? What's the dynamics of pushing back? Of basically, because I imagine some of it is culture, but I imagine every university has a bunch of students who will protest basically every speaker, and it's a question of how you respond to that protest.
Well, here's the dirty little secret about like the big change in 2014. And Fire and me and Haidt have been very clear that the big change that we saw on campus was that for most of my career, students were great on freedom of speech. They were the best constituency for free speech, absolutely unambiguously, until about 2013, 2014. And it was only in 2014 where we had this very, kind of sad for us experience where suddenly students were the ones advocating for deplatforming and new speech codes, kind of in a similar way that they had been doing in, say, like the mid-'80s, for example. But here's the dirty little secret. It's not just the students. It's students and administrators, sometimes only a handful of them, though, working together to create some of these problems. And this was exactly what happened at Stanford when Kyle Duncan, a Fifth Circuit judge, tried to speak at my alma mater, and a fifth of the class showed up to shout him down. It was a real showing of what was going on. That 10 minutes into the shout down of a Fifth Circuit judge, and I keep on emphasizing that because I'm a constitutional lawyer. Fifth Circuit judges are big deals. They're one level below the Supreme Court. About a fifth of the school shows up to shout him down. After 10 minutes of shouting him down, a DEI administrator, gets up with a prepared speech that she's written. That's a 7-minute long speech where she talks about free speech. Maybe the juice isn't worth the squeeze. And we're at this law school where people could learn to challenge these norms. So it's clear that there was coordination, among some of these administrators. And from talking to students there, they were in meetings, extensive meetings for a long time. They show up, do a shout down. Then they take an additional 7 minutes to lecture the speaker on free speech not the juice of free speech not being worth the squeeze. And then for the rest of it, it's just constant heckling after she leaves. This is clearly, and something very similar, happened a number of times at Yale, where it was very clearly administrators were helping along with a lot of these disruptions. So I think every time there is a shout down at a university, the investigation should be, first and foremost, did administrators help create this problem? Did they do anything to stop it? Because I think a lot of what's really going on here is the hyper-bureaucratization of universities with a lot more ideological people who think of their primary job as basically like policing speech, more or less. Mm-hmm. They're encouraging students. They're encouraging students who have opinions they like. Mm-hmm. To do shout downs. And that's why they really need to investigate this. And it is at Stanford, the administrator who gave the prepared remarks about the juice not being worth the squeeze, she has not been invited back to Stanford. But she's one of the only examples I can think of when these things happen a lot, where an administrator clearly facilitated something that was a shout down or a deplatforming or resulted in a professor getting fired or resulted in a student getting expelled, where the administrator has got off scot-free or probably in some cases even gotten a promotion.
And so a small number of administrators, maybe even a single administrator, could participate in the encouraging and the organization and thereby empower the whole process.
And that's something I've seen throughout my entire career. And the only thing is kind of hard to catch this sort of in the act, so to speak. And that's one of the reasons why it's helpful for people to know about this, because there was this amazing case. This was at University of Washington, and we actually featured this in a documentary made in 2015, that came out in 2015, 2016, called Can We Take a Joke? And this was when we started noticing something was changing on campus. We also heard that comedians were saying that they couldn't use their good humor anymore. This was right around the time that Jerry Seinfeld and Chris Rock said that they didn't want to play on campuses because they couldn't be funny. But we featured a case of a comedian who wanted to do a musical called The Passion of the Musical, making fun of the Passion of the Christ, with the stated goal of offending everyone, every group equally. It was very much a South Park mission. And it's an unusual case because we actually got documentation of administrators buying tickets for angry students and holding an event where they trained them to jump up in the middle of it and shout, "I'm offended." Like they bought them tickets, they sent them to this thing with the goal of shouting it down. Now, unsurprisingly, when you send an angry group of students to shut down a play, it's not going to end at just "I'm offended." And it got heated. There were death threats being thrown. And then the Pullman, Washington police told Chris Lee, the guy who made the play, that they wouldn't actually protect him. Now, it's not every day you're going to have that kind of hard evidence that of actually seeing the administrators be so brazen that they recorded the fact that they bought them tickets and sent them. But I think a lot of that stuff is going on, and I think it's a good excuse to cut down on one of the big problems in higher education today, which is hyper bureaucratization.
In your experience, is there a distinction between administrators and faculty in terms of perpetrators of these kinds of things? So if we got rid of all, like Harvey's talked about, getting rid of a large percentage of the administration, does that help fix the problem, or is the faculty also small percent of the faculty also part of the encouraging and the organization of these kind of cancel mobs?
Yeah, and that's something that has been profoundly disappointing, is that when you look at the huge uptick in attempts to get professors fired that we've seen over the last 10 years, and actually over the last 22 years, as far back as our records go, at first, they were overwhelmingly led by administrators to attempts to get professors punished. And that was I'd say that was my career up until 2013 was fighting back at administrative excesses. Then you start having the problem in 2014 of students trying to get people canceled. And that really accelerated in 2017. And the number, so one thing that makes it easier to document are the petitions to get professors fired or punished. And how disproportionately those actually do come from students. But another big uptick has been fellow professors demanding that their fellow professors get punished. And that to me
really sad.
It's kind of shameful. You shouldn't be proud of signing the petition to get your fellow professor. And what's even more shameful is that we get this has almost become a cliche within FIRE. When someone is facing one of these cancellation campaigns as a professor, I would get letters from some of my friends saying, "I am so sorry this has happened to you." And these were the same people who publicly signed the petition to get them fired.
Yeah. Integrity. Integrity is an important thing in this world. And I think some of it, I'm so surprised people don't stand up more for this, because there's so much hunger for it. And if you have the guts as a faculty or an administrator to really stand up with eloquence, with rigor, with integrity, I feel like it's impossible for anyone to do anything, because there's such a hunger. It's so refreshing.
Yeah.
I think everybody agrees that freedom of speech is a good thing.
Oh, I don't.
Well, okay, sorry.
I don't agree.
The majority of people, even at the universities, that there's a hunger, but it's almost like this kind of nervousness around it, because there's a small number of loud voices that are doing the shouting. So, I mean, again, that's where great leadership comes in. And so, presidents of universities should probably be making clear declarations of like, this is a place where we value the freedom of expression.
And this was all throughout my career. A university president who puts their foot down early and says, nope, we are not entertaining firing this professor. We are not expelling this student. It ends the issue often very fast. Although sometimes, and this is where you can really tell the administrative involvement, students will do things like take over the president's office, and then that takeover will be catered by the university. People will point this out sometimes as being kind of like, oh, it was clearly my friend Sam Abrams when they tried to get him fired at Sarah Lawrence College. That was one of the times that it was used as kind of like, oh, this was hostile to the university because the students took over the president's office. And I'm like, no, they let them take over the president's office. And I don't know if that was one of the cases in which the takeover was catered, but if there was ever sort of like a sign that's kind of like, yes, this is actually really quite friendly.
Well, in some sense, like protesting and having really strong opinions, even like ridiculous, crazy, wild opinions is a good thing. It's just, it shouldn't lead to actual firing or deplatforming of people. Like, it's good to protest. It's just not good to for a university to support that and take action based on it.
And this is one of those like tensions in First Amendment that actually I think has a pretty easy release. Essentially, you absolutely have the right to devote your life to ending freedom of speech and ridiculing it as a concept. And there are people who really can come off as very contemptible about even the philosophy of freedom of speech. And we will defend your right to do that. We will also disagree with you. And if you try to get a professor fired, we will be on the other side of that. Now, I think you had Randy Kennedy, who I love him. I think he's a great guy, but he criticized us for our deplatforming database as saying that students can't protest speakers. I'm like, okay, that's silly. We FIRE as an organization have defended the right to protest all the time. We are constantly defending the rights the rights of protesters. Not believing that the protesters have the right to say this would that would be punishing the speakers. We're not calling for punishing the protesters, but what we are saying is you can't let the protesters win if they're demanding someone be fired for their freedom of speech.
So the line there is between protesters protesting and the university taking action based on the protest.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, shout downs. That's just mob censorship, and that's something where the university, the way you deal with that tension in First Amendment law is essentially kind of like the one positive duty that the government has. The negative duty, the thing that it's not allowed to do, is censor you. Mm-hmm. But its positive duty is that if I want to say awful things, or for that matter, great things that aren't popular in a public park, you can't let the crowd just shout me down. You can't allow what's called a heckler's veto.
Heckler's veto. That's so interesting because I feel like that comes into play on social media somehow. Totally. Because there's this whole discussion about censorship and freedom of speech, but to me, the carrot question is almost more interesting. Once the freedom of speech is established, is how do you incentivize high quality debate and disagreement?
I'm thinking a lot about that. And that's one of the things we talk about in Counseling of the American Mind is arguing towards truth. Mm-hmm. And that cancel culture is cruel, it's merciless, it's anti-intellectual, but it also will never get you anywhere near truth. And you are going to waste so much time destroying your opponents in something that can actually never get you to truth through the process, of course, of you never actually get directly at truth. You just chip away at falsity.
Yeah. But everybody having a megaphone on the internet with anonymity, it seems like it's better than censorship, but it feels like there's incentives on top of that you can construct to incentivize better discourse.
Yeah.
It's like to incentivize somebody who puts a huge amount of effort to make even the most ridiculous arguments, but basically ones that don't include any of the things you highlight in terms of all the rhetorical tricks to shut down conversations. Just make really good arguments for whatever. It doesn't matter if it's communism, for fascism, whatever the heck you want to say.
Yeah.
But do it with skill, with historical context, with with steel man on the other side, all those kind of elements.
We try to make three major points in the book. One is just simply cancel culture is real. It's a historic era, and it's on a historic scale. The second one is you should think of cancel culture as part of a as a larger, lazy rhetorical approach to what we refer to as winning arguments without winning arguments. And we mean that in two senses: without having winning arguments, or without actually having won arguments. And we talk about all the different what we call rhetorical fortresses that both the left and the right have that that allow you to just dismiss the person or dodge the argument without actually ever getting to the substance of the argument. Third part is just, how do we fix it? But the rhetorical fortress stuff is actually something I'm very passionate about, because it interferes with our ability to get at truth, and it wastes time, and frankly, it also since cancel culture is part of that rhetorical tactic, it can also ruin lives.